Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and this is our last live show before we go on summer vacation. We'll have some taped shows next week and throughout the summer, but we always take a break to do outdoor stuff for this time of year. My guest tonight is Art Costa, and as long as I've known Art, which is well over a decade now, he has thought about, researched, and talked about sustainability and resiliency in our community. And he still is, so welcome, Art.
Thank you.
And I know you've come up with some new thoughts. Thinking about sustainability and resilience is not a static issue at all.
Right.
And so let's...
Yeah, well, obviously...
Where are we now?
Yeah, where are we? Well, we have an interesting situation, to put it mildly, and I'm a little, I don't know if you'd call it sarcastically, but we're all mobilized to deal with this climate change and this ecological degradation. We're all moving forward, and that's our challenge. And so maybe in part it has to do with how do you mobilize people, and to meet up with this huge challenge of climate change, and it's happening. As someone once said recently, people say, well, is that storm the result of, climate change? And they say it's the wrong question. Every storm is now part of the climate change. So it's not like, it's like a fire. Does it really matter that the fire started at a camp, or that somebody lit a match and threw it, or it was an electric wire or something? The intensity of the fire is what we're talking about at that point, and the devastation that follows. So, yeah, but I've taken a certain look at this from a systemic perspective. I tend to see things from a systems perspective, and I think what we have is clearly a deep systems problem. And the only way to solve systemic problems is with systemic solutions. And so it's really difficult, I think, to approach these environmental, ecological problems as if they can be compartmentalized and treated as just if we could just spend more money on this or spend less money on that or whatever. Certainly we need funding, financing for things, but it really comes down to identifying, what the core or root cause problems are. And I'm always amazed that I don't know what it is. If we have people in this country that understand problem solving and really understand identification of a problem, I'm not sure, they may not be the ones that are in power. And politics do have a way of shifting things into what can and cannot be said. And so, our economics, almost all the systems we talk about are human creations. That is, we've fabricated these systems, and hence they can be changed.
Even though some of them have such a long tradition that we don't really think much about changing them.
Right. And the other issue with systems is that systems inherently resist change. And so self-preservation of a system is something that comes with it. And so if you've identified the problem as the system, and that is not the natural system, because that's the system of all systems, but the ones that we create, then it's a question of, what is it that we can do or are willing to do to address it. And I think that one of the core issues we have that never gets addressed in any document I've read in terms of legislation or resolutions is growth, economic growth. And we know that it's economic growth that actually perpetuates the extraction of resources, of fossil use and abuse, and the idea that we have to grow and grow and grow on a planet that's finite just doesn't make sense. And so we have managed to kind of defy nature in our own way, in our own minds, in our own setup.
It won't last.
Yeah, we are now hitting the end game. And that's something that I don't think people fully understand. Some people do, and other people just think that this is something technology will take care of. I don't think technology is up to this. We've dodged some things, but they've only made matters, in some cases, worse, not better, even though it was a temporary situation. But I think understanding that our systems can be changed, and that at the same time realizing that there is a huge resistance, there is a power structure that resists change to the system, and so we end up with a lot of what seems to me to be kind of lip service at best. And so we have a president that says it's a hoax. And then we have a governor, I don't mean the current one, but the previous one that says, no, it's not a hoax, it's real, and we're the ones contributing to it, but his policies don't demonstrate that. So if we have a real dire problem, where's the action? Where's the mobilization?
Yeah, and the troubling thing is that we can't really negotiate our way out of this. It isn't like a contract dispute among different human parties. Nature, climate, it really calls the shots ultimately. We're the ones who have to adapt.
Exactly. We need to learn. We've had, particularly in Western civilization, and that's to exclude many indigenous people, have had this sense of trying to, overwhelm nature, to control it, to build roads through it, and we've now reached a point with our farming and so forth where we're destroying soil. And I know we're going to get to this a little bit, but I think a few years ago I was down at the Smithsonian, and at their natural
The natural history.
Natural history one. Yeah. And they had, I don't know if it was temporary or not, but they had a display on soil. And what I really remember is a plaque that says, "The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." FDR. And so he had a sense of that then. I'm not going to say what his policies were or weren't or what have you, but I think that speaks volumes, because he was really speaking for the natural world, not just soil, but soil is a huge part of that. So I found that kind of interesting that he made that kind of remark. But again, as you said, Rana, nature is not negotiable. We are either going to have to learn how to adapt, or, well, the other is not a very pretty picture.
Well, because you brought up FDR, it's like there have been voices in our country, probably at least for the last century, that have, maybe voices in the wilderness that have tried to keep this in our collective consciousness, and they generally have not translated to national policy. Yeah. But the idea of growth being the sign of a not just healthy but a vibrant economy, that's so ingrained in us. I'm not quite sure. Where do you go from
how do we
how
get
do you
beyond
change?
it? Yeah.
Mindset.
It is very tough, because we have been told over and over and over again. There was a moment where the door was open, actually a couple of times, but particularly back even in the late 60s, where people seemed to be willing to kind of look at some of these problems and question whether or not we were on the right track. And there was a gentleman, we used GDP, and we're going to grow our way out of a recession, and we're going to grow our way into full employment and so forth. And these are just mythologies in a way, but before that, the GDP has been around for centuries, but it really wasn't formulated in the way we understand it until 1934, during the Great Depression and then the war, by a guy, an economist named Simon Kuznets. And Simon Kuznets went before the Congress to report, the use of this gross domestic product, and he warned never to use this as a way of gauging how well your society or economy are doing, that this was simply to get us through a Great Depression and the war effort. So we needed to count transactions, cash flow, and that sort of thing. So, of course, we didn't heed those, along with many other words of wisdom. And we didn't even
because
heed
it did actually have a short-term impact. The federal investment in all those jobs programs plus the war effort did bring a period of prosperity in a sense.
Right, and the idea that there was almost a coincidence that this GDP, which was really just a way of counting and saying how things were going, just to get your arms around it, turned out to be kind of, okay, this is what we're going to use. And then we took this notion and we put it on steroids. And then we didn't just put it on steroids, we exported it to the world. And so the world now compares one another, countries do, in terms of how their economy is growing. And so we did have, and maybe just a brief showing of Robert Kennedy on this. He had something I think very important to say about gross domestic product. The only thing I would say is that there are some things he says which some people in the audience may not be familiar with because they happened during I think it was 1968 or 67
Yeah,
or
50
something.
years ago.
Yeah. So while they were, very apparent to me, somebody much younger might wonder what some of these are. Not to mention, I think he says the GDP is $800 billion. Well, we're now talking about a multiple of trillions of dollars. So when
I looked at it, I was wondering what the current number is. Yeah, let's bring that up.
Too much and for too long, we seem to have surrendered personal excellence and community values in the mere accumulation of material things. Our gross national product now is over $800 billion a year. But that gross national product, if we judge the United States of America by that gross national product counts air pollution and cigarette advertising and ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts special locks for our doors and the jails for the people who break them. It counts the destruction of the redwoods and the loss of our natural wonder in chaotic sprawl. It counts napalm, and it counts nuclear warheads and armored cars for the police to fight the riots in our cities. It counts Whitman's rifle and Speck's knife, and the television programs which glorify violence in order to sell toys to our children. Yet the gross national product does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It does not include the beauty of our poetry, or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate, or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our wit nor our courage, neither our wisdom nor our learning, neither our compassion nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. And it can tell us everything about America, except why we are proud that we are Americans.
Okay,
Okay, we're back.
we're back. I hope we could hear, you could all hear that out there. We'll put it on YouTube also. And
Sure.
if the audio isn't great, we'll put in better
Yeah.
audio for viewing on YouTube.
I'll kind of summarize it
Yeah.
too. What Robert Kennedy was saying there was something that we never hear anymore. And it's truly amazing when I listen to some of these 1960s, even John Kennedy, his talk at the American University commencement, riveting for a half an hour, what he talked about, world peace. Again, we don't really hear much about that anymore. But in the case of Robert Kennedy, he simply said that much of the GDP is based on things that are, one could say, counterproductive.
They certainly are things that don't add value to our lives.
Right, and frequently oil spills add to the GDP, divorces add.
Yeah,
If somebody
high prison
has
populations.
our prison population, if somebody has cancer, that adds to the GDP. So we have a lot of indicators, if you will, or a collection of information that we gather that is really contrary to our well-being. It really has nothing to do with how people's lives are. If there's a welfare for people and the well-being. So, and so that brings us back to what the purpose of an economy is, and it should be, I would think, to be reasonably stable, but also to provide a sense of well-being for the people that live within that economy, and that really is crucial. So the GDP is something we've Robert Kennedy, I think, nailed it with a lot of points in there, and really began to question. And there was an organization, I don't know how active it is now, that was really pushing for legislation to rethink progress, quite frankly, redefine it, how we think about progress, given the fact that GDP is a major contributor to the degradation of the ecology, and a big contributor to global warming. And that's where we've taken off with fossil back in the mid-19th century, and it just kept going.
Well, when I had never seen this video of Robert Kennedy's, but I recall in the 1970s, there was some discussion of the fact that, we have thrived economically, finding new frontiers, but we were running out of frontiers, new frontiers to conquer already 40 years ago.
Right.
And, when you look at the fossil fuels, or you look at, the great forests of the world, or you look at, just all the all kinds of non-renewable resources.
Yeah, I do think that, for me, getting back to this notion of a systems issue, and this is a human-devised, a gentleman who was highly regarded as an economist, but warned about using this beyond its very limited purpose, that this has really been put a huge thrust on where our species has been going anyway, but with this idea of growth being never-ending. And also, there was a time in the mid-19th century to the 20th century when economists looked at three components to an economy, which was labor, capital, and land. By the late 19th century into the early 20th century was something called neoclassical economics. That's when we get all these fancy models and everything. Land disappeared entirely, so it was just capital and labor. And even labor is getting shortchanged with automation, but the point is, when you take land out of the equation, you end up with externalities. In other words, the earth is to be used, and nobody has to pay the price, at least financially. Profits are earned off of these resources, which are not even viewed as meaningful, that the earth is here just to consume it. And so we have an economy, as we kind of all know, it's built on consumerism, and when people run out of money, then there's credit card debt, and so we really have consumerism run on debt. And so we have an economy that's basically running on debt, and at the same time creating this huge problem that we're faced with, both in global warming with CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we're emitting, and then the destruction to our forests. I forget how much of the earth over the next 20 years will become nothing but desert as we deforest much of the planet. And of course our waterways, with the way we farm and so forth, have become. So that's the news as it is. There is another way of looking at this, and that is either eliminating and or reforming GDP and making that financial, transaction that it currently runs to a little bit more tied to our well-being as human beings. So there's something called the Genuine Progress Indicator. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or not.
I hadn't before this afternoon.
Okay. In any case, that's basically when somebody gets a divorce, the GPI does not consider that something that is a positive thing.
But it might boost the GDP.
Yeah, it may end up in the GDP, but now if you've got a comparison of how people are doing, and many other indicators of the environment, what's the degradation to the environment? So if the state of Connecticut had a GPI, currently it has only a GSP, which is a state version of a GDP. And so it's got billions and billions of dollars of GSP. But if it also had a GPI, we could be looking at this and saying, well, over time, we're starting to get our arms around some of these issues of crime and pathologies, really, that social pathologies which create, our opioid addictions and so forth. And we begin to look at these things and how we're improving the quality of life for people. And it's the old E.F. Schumacher, small is beautiful, economics is if people matter. And so this GPI is in fact something that came out of work by a man named Daly and Cobb, John Cobb and I'm trying to remember, Herman Daly. And Herman really is an outstanding ecologist and economist. I think he's up for a Nobel Peace Prize, in fact, along with the young lady who is out there charging away.
Yeah.
What's her name? I don't remember her name now, but she's like 16 years old, and she's been doing all kinds of things. But so he's really, a much older gentleman, but he's done some great work, and GPI is one of the things that came out of his work with John Cobb. And so that's a little bit of that. I would say that GPI minimally would complement GDP, and that it would give us something else to look at to say, well, how are things really going in Connecticut? And let me make this a little realer. That is, there are 20 states who have adopted GPI. And there are a number of countries that have. I mean, I remember, what's his name? Sarkozy, who is the French Prime Minister. And while I didn't think he was a great green kind of leader, but he embraced this in a pretty strenuous way, and they did a great amount of exploration, research, and so forth. But it's tough to live in two worlds, and when the dominant world is all about growth, it's hard for the rest of the world to say, no, we're not going down that path, although many nations are moving in that direction. But there are 20 states. I can only mention two that I recall. One is Vermont, which was the first, and then Maryland. And Maryland has been a really out there. And so associated with the University of Vermont is Gun Institute, and that is all built around kind of ecological economics, and really the work of Daly. And they've been really helping with the implementation and the deploying this kind of metric or series of metrics to help with folks to understand exactly what happens when you build certain things and do certain things. What are the ecological or environmental costs? What are the general human costs? What suffers when you have money going here versus education or versus healthcare or what have you? So it's an important, I think.
As you talk about this, it seems to me that the GPI also values, I don't know, it sounds funny, but efficiency in a way that GDP does not. GDP is looking for growth. And personally, I've always been really interested in how you can get ensure a good quality of life, make sure people get the education they need, they can live in decent surroundings, have uplifting lives, using the fewest amount of resources. And it's from my childhood. I lived in a row house, and some people who live in the suburbs say, oh, every child needs a preschool because how do they get a peer group otherwise? Well, there were like 50 kids on my block who were born, in about a 10-year span. We had a peer group without any external expense having to be made. No schools had to be built, no teachers had to be hired. And even though I was a preschool teacher, I appreciate that as a child, we got this, maybe not exactly for free, but it was kind of built into the way our lives were organized.
Right. Play. You just pickup games were constantly. We do see some pickup games at Toby May, I know, but generally speaking, everything is organized and structured, and parents are bringing kids to and from. There's a lot to be said about something like a redefining what we mean by progress, and the fact that what we've done by taking land out of that equation is to create a progress that begins to diminish the distribution of wealth, so that wealth becomes concentrated. I mean, if you basically have a debt-based economy, whose debt is it? Who owns the debt, and who gets the interest on that debt? So you see where things are being shifted away from people, and in a whole number of ways.
And of course, we're becoming indebted monetarily, but we're also indebted in terms of the resources available to us.
Exactly.
Future generations are going to pay.
Oh, absolutely. I think we're going to pay as well. I forget which Louis it was that was King of France at the time, but he, in French, said something like, after me, the floods. So basically it was like, I'm going to live for today and let them take care of it. But I don't think we have that, we can even say that, although many people would prefer not to anyway. They believe in the idea of their generations passing down and their children and grandchildren. So I do think that people really want to do something. We're in a kind of emergency that's not always easy to see on a nation that has this kind of landmass where floods are here, fires are there, tornadoes are here, and so forth. So we don't always see these things and observe them at the same time. But I think the other thing is we have to be serious about what the problem is and the fact that there's a resistance to solving it, even if there's more and more of an acknowledgement that it exists. And that people, you know, if you have an emergency, then and you need to mobilize people, you have to focus them on what it is that they need to do. And so a couple of systems things that have interest me is farming and regenerative farming, where it's kind of a real serious take on organic farming, but on a large scale where we convert our farms. And I mean, we need to convert all of them from the fossil-based pesticides and so forth that are polluting our streams and really creating food that is somewhat questionable. How we farm in general needs to kind of be rethought. And there are a lot of farmers. In fact, farming is really having a very tough time. I was amazed to hear that one of the highest rates of suicides is among farmers in this country. I knew about it in India, but I didn't know here. And so this really helps when farmers are no longer spraying pesticides on plants, when they're treating their land and the biodiversity of the land, and getting back to the FDR statement that, you know, if you destroy your soil, you destroy your nation. And right now we have, through those basins out into the Gulf, we have a dead zone because of these types of activities with pesticides and all kinds of antibiotics that are injected into animals due to the way we farm. We have a dead zone in the Gulf the size of Connecticut. So wow. This is just, you know, I don't know how long that will be if it can be, you know, rebirthed, regenerated. And so there's a lot of activity going on. Some of it is happening in oceans and what have you. But at least a regenerative farming, which is something we know, if we started to do this nationwide, we could begin to not only reduce the carbon that's being emitted out of the soil, but we can start to draw down carbon through plants and photosynthesis and all of those natural things that can happen. I don't know if we can play that one. Do you think so?
I think we can. Let me check and make sure the volume is as high as it can go, and we'll try this.
People, you're probably feeling a little hopeless about climate change and the damage we've done to our planet. Well, now there's a new way to look at climate change and how to deal with it that might just turn that hopelessness into hope. Climate change, as we know, is all about too much carbon in our atmosphere. But carbon is not our enemy. It's the building block of life. Everything alive is made of it, even us. The problem and the solution are simply a matter of balance. Let's step back and look at the 5 pools where carbon is stored on planet Earth. Starting about 500 million years ago, when plants first appeared on land, carbon began to cycle in an amazing balance between these pools, a balance that allowed for life as we know it to evolve. Then one life form, that would be us, figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil pool, which was pretty much a timeout zone for carbon. We've been burning it for energy, putting into play, and disrupting that balance. The way we manage land and do agriculture is moving even more carbon into the atmosphere. Specifically, we've moved 880 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating up the planet and destabilizing our climate. The oceans have absorbed a lot of this excess carbon, throwing off the ocean's balance, resulting in ocean acidification and accelerating a mass extinction of sea life. So in order to save life as we know it, of course we need to stop burning fossil carbon. The big question is, where do we put this excess carbon to get the cycle back in balance? The good news is that the answer is literally right under our feet. It's the soil. Plants, using sunlight and water, naturally perform photosynthesis. They pull carbon in from the air and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars. Then they pump some of these sugars down through the roots to feed microorganisms who use that carbon to build healthy soil. Voila, carbon moved. The plants pump it in, and the soil stores it. Nature's living technology is amazing. Scientists have recently discovered that applying a thin layer of compost can help regenerate healthy soil, setting up an ongoing feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year. Together with other regenerative practices like not tilling the soil, planting trees and cover crops, and planned grazing, we can build and retain billions of tons of soil carbon. This is carbon farming. This is regenerative agriculture. Unlike more carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the ground is good for us. It makes healthy soil, which is nutrient-rich and full of life and holds way more water. This means more nutritious food and crops that are more resilient in the face of drought. That's good news for farmers, families, and everyone who eats. Remember this, the way we grow our food, fiber, and fuel either puts carbon up into our atmosphere or pulls it down into the ground. The regeneration of soil is the task of our generation. Our health, the health of our soils, and the health of our planet are one and the same.
Very good. Okay, well, we went through that. Hopefully that explained it all. The only cautionary note with any solution is that it can make it seem like, okay, if the farmers just take care of our CO2, we don't have to do anything. That's not true. This is a natural way, along with trees and forests, which make a huge difference in terms of retaining carbon, which, as that little video states, is critical to life. So carbon is not our enemy, and it's essential as oxygen to us. So you need that component, but you just don't need it by the tons, hundreds of thousands or millions of tons in our atmosphere. That's not natural. And so we have, this is an approach that I think is a much better approach than some of these geoengineering concepts where it may cost trillions of dollars to pull carbon out of the sky. If we would just simply use nature, if you will, and see that it can be our friend instead of trying to dominate it at all times, and by doing that, looking for technology to get you out of your, the hole you dug yourself into.
Well, now watching this, I seem to recall maybe a group that you and I were part of showing some videos about no-till farming.
Right.
Maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
Yep.
And it's really an intriguing idea that, tilling is not really the way to go. And living in Connecticut, we might be in a better situation to create a change here than in the Plain States that are, the topography lends itself to giant farms.
Right.
We don't really have giant farms in our state.
Right. Yeah, we don't.
Done with it?
Yeah, we're done. You can take it.
Yeah, we don't have giant farms, but interestingly enough, the Dakotas and those flyover plain states are embracing this more and more. There's a film, and I don't even know where it takes place, called the Biggest Little Farm.
Oh, yeah, I don't think
And
I've
it was
seen
just out. It goes to art theaters and stuff like that. I mean, Madison had it. I highly recommend it if you get a chance to somehow see it. But it does bring home this whole story. You see how this couple that want to be farmers, but they want to do it as natural as possible. But they're struggling with nature. Nature seems to be, throwing them curveballs all the time. And then they begin to realize that if they work with nature, how much all of this is interconnected and that it's kind of a web of life. And when you do that, they were able to survive the farm, that is, a terrible storm that came through and destroyed farms around them that had been using, non-natural methods of farming and were much bigger. But it took them some time to learn what they needed to do. But they were patient and they learned. And that's an important thing to realize that what may seem like a fox coming in and doing something is actually that fox also does some really good things. And but anyway, so that's a little bit of something that can, and I'm hopeful we can find a way to help shift in a much more intentional way this kind of farming. And I agree, if we could do something in Connecticut and maybe begin to really recapture our farmlands. I know we have some, more than is always being used, but with these methods, you're really trying to create biodiversity, healthy soil, and you get a healthy harvest as well. These produce a lot of food. And of course, the food mileage and all that, if you can reduce that and keep it close to home, that is all a contributing factor.
Well, the efficiency obsessed part of me also really likes this idea of making things, farming a little more of a closed system. What we do now is we take things that could be resources and we turn them into waste, and then we create waste where we could be using the stuff. And
that's a segue, and I don't know how much time
yes.
we have here.
Oh, we have about 10 minutes.
Okay, so I'll go into one other
Sure.
topic of something that I think is very valuable, that is compatible with GPI and what Daley and folks have been talking about for quite some time, and that is the circular economy. I'll preface this by saying that Europe has really embraced this. In fact, they've gone through a series of improvements on this approach, which is that that the last thing you do is throw something away. Even if it's recycled, which is better than it ending up somewhere else in the ocean or in a dump or whatever. But the idea is reuse of everything, so that I'll use a simple example. I was reading John Foley was a reporter for The Day some years ago. And he wrote a piece. He had done some digging, and back in the 1920s, New London had all these things. It was amazing. But the one thing that really just completely blew my mind was the fact that we had 40 shoe repair shops. And so it made me think again about...
We probably had a couple of factories that made shoes from scratch, too.
We probably made them here.
Yeah.
And so what better reuse than not just simply throwing shoes away because you can't have them repaired. So this whole notion of what we really need to have a healthy, happy life, and not simply be part of the game of consuming to the point where we're trying to keep the economy going, but what are we getting from it? How happy are we with this? And I think that you know, even things like population, and we know we're over 7 billion. It took us thousands and thousands of years just to hit 1 billion. And within just over a century, we're at 7, and soon to be 10 if their projections are correct. And as we know, we do consume a lot of the planet. And so we have to be thinking about, you know, how we live differently on this planet, I think. But also, when people are happier, when they feel they're secure, and they don't feel afraid, whether it's of losing a job or income or health care and so forth, they tend to have less children. And so that again is the value of a GPI. I mean, wealthier nations tend to have lower birth rates.
Right.
And so I think we really want to help bring that about, not only here, but also in other countries where people create actually their security by having many children. It's their way of creating almost a little
Sure.
community, and to help them through old age and so forth. So as our societies begin to mature and begin to, I think, support people in very meaningful ways, then and making sure the whole globe is kind of moving in this direction, we'll see a reduction in population as opposed to an explosion of population. We can reduce the shipping of food all over the world. People know how to grow food. They really do. We almost took it away from them by shipping it and undermining their own agriculture. But so there's a lot that can be done. The circular economy really means reuse at all levels, and that can mean even things like, rather than owning appliances, that you basically pay to rent or lease an appliance, and when they need to be fixed, the manufacturer and or whoever leased it to you has got to take it away, fix it, or give you another one, but they're cycling it through. So back to efficiency, that business sees it to their advantage to keep these not planned obsolescence, but the opposite, to keep these up and running.
And these repair jobs can't be outsourced, which is one other advantage of repairing rather than replacing everything. Well, we're down to about 4 minutes.
4 minutes.
And
okay.
I didn't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about the whole concept of public banking.
Well, the whole...
I know you have in 3 minutes. Or like,
in 3 minutes. Well, I think it's another important thing. I would love to have seen the state of Connecticut run forward on this, do an exploration of it. The thing is by having a public bank, and let me be clear, there is a definite firewall between this bank and the state government, so they can't dip into this. And a public bank is not a revolving loan, which is what the Green Bank is. And so it is a full banking system, much like a commercial banking system, but it's very transparent and can provide very, very low interest loans to municipalities. It can eliminate much of the bonding that happens, which goes directly to Wall Street. And the key thing is to understand where our money goes. I mean, a lot of times we just think our money is going to, you know, education in those poor cities and this and that. But a huge amount of our money, particularly pensions, is going to Wall Street. And based on how that's doing, you know, so goes the pension plans and what have you. And it can take forever to recover from a real deep, you know, turn in that market.
now we know that North Dakota has had a public bank for a century now. Just, are there any states that seem to be serious about moving forward with the idea?
Well, yeah, there was actually a governor, a guy named, he just ran and won, I want to say New Jersey, Is it Murphy that's a governor of New Jersey? Or is it Maryland? I get those confused sometimes. But New Jersey, yeah. Okay, so he ran on a public bank, and they're moving on it. I know they put a task force together. But California is doing a lot of things. A lot of municipalities, because they're fairly large. So San Francisco, Los Angeles, and they're making some pretty good headway there at the municipal level. And you know, it's not easy when you're working through the politics of it, because politicians have pet projects. So when you talk about a public bank, they want to run with it as an infrastructure bank or and the idea is it's a bank. It's not a bank only to do farming or only to do renewable energy or whatever. It's a bank for all of those plus, and that can be a challenge. So in Connecticut, we did make an attempt. We had some conference calls and so forth to get things moving. Not this year.
Okay, keep working at it. So in the last 30 seconds, what can people do to get some of these system changes happening?
I think what really has to be done, and it's all about organizing and movements. And I think there's a lot of things that we can and need to be doing in New London, in the greater New London area. What are our plans for really dealing with this in terms of resiliency and so forth? I know that there are some conservation plans that the city has, but in general and specifically, what gets built and where and how, and all of these things are critical. In Hodges Square, for instance, where I've been kind of working around there since 2012, I think, a large part of what I'm concerned about is I want that area to be a good community for the people who live there, and sure, let's attract some more folks, but we're not looking to push people out, and we want it to be a healthy place to live. We want the quality of life, and that means environmental soundness in that area when we think about doing things.
Well, thank you, Art. We're out of time, and a lot of food for thought, and it is an election year for municipal elections, so bring these issues up as there are candidate forums.
Absolutely.
So again, thank you, and have a good summer, everyone.
Thank you.